In this video, we will take a few minutes to examine a number of equity statements. We will focus on the common threads and what ideas are actually fostered by a few of our school boards and other leading institutions. The ones selected are just a sample of the many available ones. I do hope you'll take some time to examine others and also create your own personal equity statement. The first definition comes from the Ministry of Education website from the Ontario Equity and Inclusive Education Strategy 2016 Quick Facts section. Equity and inclusive education aims to identify, address, and eliminate the biases and barriers that limit students' prospects for learning, growing, and fully contributing to society. Barriers may be related to sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, race, ethnic origin, religion, socioeconomic background, physical or mental ability, or other factors. Some of the words we want to look at are identify, address, eliminate, and barriers. What are those barriers that you face? What are those barriers faced by your students or other colleagues? From the same document, we are also reminded that equity does not mean treating people the same without regard for individual differences. Before we examine the next equity statement, let us pause for a minute to examine barriers. Global Link 2014 compiled a list of 10 barriers to education around the world. Lack of funding for education, having no teacher or untrained teacher, no classroom, lack of learning material and resources, exclusion of children with disabilities, being the wrong gender, living in conflict or the risk of conflict, distance from school, hunger and poor nutrition, and of course, cost of education. After you look at this list, what questions do you have about equity? This is a world list, but are you aware of the barriers in your own school, your board, or of course the country faced by those most vulnerable among us? As an educator, are you actually aware of the barriers faced by your students or even some of your colleagues? What educational policies are in place to counter and eliminate these barriers? Are you aware of the equity policy at your school? And finally, what are your thoughts in relation to your own power and privilege? The next statement comes from the Peel District School Board. We provide equity of access and opportunity for students and staff to learn, work, and develop in an environment that is safe, nurturing, engaging, respectful, and inclusive. The words that are common here again are access, opportunity, learn, safe, inclusive. There are a few questions we should be asking ourselves for reflection. Number one, what does a safe, nurturing, engaging, respectful, and inclusive school look like? Number two, who is being engaged at your school? Number three, who is not being engaged? Number four, who is being left out or pushed to the edges in your school? What equity promise is to ensure that we take the time to create opportunities and access so that these very students are fully engaged. As we continue our personal reflection, at this point, I wish for us to stop and think. Think about your school in regards to equity. What are the policies? How do we see the operation of equity in the school? What are the programs and how are they equitable? What are the common practices in your school? The next definition comes from the Toronto Catholic District School Board, and it defines equity as a condition or state of fair, inclusive, and respectful treatment of all people. Equity does not mean treating people the same without regard for individual differences. Here again, we see the common threads of fair, respectful, and individual differences. As we reflect, do you celebrate individual differences, or are you constantly trying to disregard the differences around you? How do you foster individuality and differences? Who is different in your school or learning community? What makes them different? Who is being excluded because they have been labeled as different? Why have we made different so difficult? And that is something I want to repeat. Why is it that we have made being different so difficult? A section of the Toronto District School Board Equity Foundation statement reads, "We believe that equity of opportunity and equity of access to our programs, services, and resources are critical to the achievement of successful outcomes for all those whom we serve and for those who serve our school system. The board is therefore committed to ensuring that fairness, equity, and inclusion are essential principles of our school system and are integrated in all our policies, programs, operations, and practices." Here again, we see the common threads: opportunity, programs, services, resources, fairness. And then we see the four major ones again: policies, programs, operations, practices. The next statement comes to us from the Kawartha Pine Ridge District School Board. And their statement in part reads, "Values equity, diversity, inclusiveness, and the dignity and humanity of each individual in its policies, practices, programs, and interactions. Equity refers to the fair and respectful treatment of all people. This means that we do everything we can to identify and eliminate unfair biases, stereotypes, or barriers that may limit full participation in our education system." What I liked about this statement is that they went on further to define barriers as a barrier is anything that keeps someone from participating fully in all aspects of society. In education, barriers limit opportunities and successful outcomes. Barriers can be visible and invisible. They can relate to physical factors like inaccessible building features, social factors like co-curriculum programs that focus on one area of interest, or academic factors such as instruction that accounts for only one learning style. Here again, we see common words, common threads: dignity, diversity, inclusiveness, policies, practices, programs, interactions, fairness, bias, stereotypes, and of course again, barriers. Are we honest about these statements? Are we genuine about equity? Do we own the statements articulated by our various institutions, or is it just a facade to say, hey, look at me, I'm doing the equity thing? Or will we allow equity to be another checked box? Is equity going to be one of those buzzwords? Then nothing happens. How do we ensure something happens? Think about those common threads: access, opportunities, resources, programs, services, removal of barriers, creating space, engaging all students, well-being, empowerment, leadership, safe environment, safe space, a safe school, and of course, fairness. One word comes to mind, and that word for me is access. What really is access? How do we create access? Who has access? Access to what? Why do some people need others to create access for them? Are we all given the same access level? Why are there so much marked differences in access from school to school within the same boards? Who is responsible for creating or balancing that access? Are we gatekeepers or door openers? I am sure by now everyone has seen a version of this picture. What is the reality at your school? Who cannot see the game in your school? Who is being left out or pushed out? How are you working to create equity in your educational community? And finally, I want to say acting on equity is deliberate. I'm going to repeat that. Acting on equity is deliberate. You have to be deliberate about our access, deliberate about our intentions, deliberate about the policies we create, deliberate about our everyday practices. Equity will demand honest effort. It is a deliberate act. Yes, it is action, not just talk.